everybody. My name is Lainey Presswood. I am the Higher Education Program Specialist at the Solutions Journalism Network, and I'm so happy to be here with you all today to join you for this very special first ever Solutions Symposium with the Bonner Foundation, and of course, more importantly, all of you. I know Bonner uses some solutions journalism in some of their other programming and some of their coursework, but if you haven't gotten to it yet, just a super quick rundown. Solutions journalism is rigorous reporting on responses to social problems. So already you can understand why it fits into so much of the work that you do at the Bonner Foundation. And you can identify it in the wild by four major characteristics. So first, solutions journalism focuses in depth on a response, obviously to a problem, and describes how the response works in meaningful detail. It's not that you can't talk about the problem at all, but the focus of a written or televised piece of solutions journalism should always be on the response first and foremost. Second, it should focus on effectiveness, not just good intentions. So we really want to see data and evidence for why the result has worked. So for example, if someone just today introduced a piece of legislation proposing to end all gun violence in New York State, which is where I am, that's amazing. I would love to see that. But as of now, with the bill just being introduced, there's no actual proof. So maybe in 2 years, that legislation would be a solution. But right now, we don't know yet. So got to have data or evidence that the solution has actually had time to work. That's number two. Number three is that it discusses the limitations of the approach with honesty and transparency. It's not that every part of every solution has to be perfect all the time. And actually, the more reporting can talk about the bits and pieces that didn't go as planned, that's better for everyone because we can all learn what went wrong. And the next time someone tries to implement a similar solution, they can do it better. Which takes us right to number four. Solution journalism should seek to provide insight that other people can use. Ideally, we want Sojo to help other communities also solve their problems. So if that hypothetical bill that ended gun violence in New York State passed and worked, we want to say, well, hey, can Illinois pass the same kind of law? Would it also work there? And why or why not? So that's my super brief rundown. And today we are here to learn about how a solutions approach can help activists or leaders or community members understand all angles of a problem and hopefully also identify its root causes so we can kick them out of the curb and create a brilliant Star Trek-esque utopia, right? So to do so, we have several very impressive journalists with us here today. I'm going to very briefly introduce them and then let them each tell you a little bit more about themselves and why they are here today and how they got to be where they are. So we're going to start with Leah Nagi, who's a veteran journalist who's covered food policy and agriculture, sustainability, and science for outlets like The Guardian, Counter, City Monitor, JSTOR Daily, Sierra, and Civil Eats. And more importantly, she also writes some books, particularly children's books about science, because you got to teach them right from the very beginning. Leila, tell us more about yourself, please.
Hi, everyone. I'm Leah Nagi. I'm a native New Yorker still living in New York. I got my start in journalism as a college student when I was going to school in Vermont, writing about the art scene, the local art scene for local papers, and had the chance to have some really amazing internships then too, and then came back to the city, started working for big national magazines like People and Life, Rest in Peace, Entertainment Weekly, all kinds of things that gave me massive burnout. Never mind what happened to media in those days with all kinds of buyouts and mergers. That's a story for another time. Took a little bit of a break and wrote books about other things for a while, then got back into journalism when I was a parent, writing about a lot of parenting issues, which is a multi-pronged sort of thing. Ran out of things to say and looked around for other things I wanted to write about and came back to. And I was very concerned with not writing just about things to eat, traveling, things like that. And I wanted to really think about where what I could do would make an actual difference. And as it happens, as I think everybody on this panel knows, food is a multi-pronged conversation with many inroads. And so now I focus on food systems with a particular focus on climate, because every story is a climate story now, as far as I'm concerned. And also social justice issues. These are just interlocking topics that just have to be sort of considered as a whole. So that's what I do. I feel like it's been a rough time for those of us who are covering food insecurity in particular in the last couple of years, but somebody's got to keep looking. So here I am.
Yes, thank you, Leila. We're going to circle back around to the food discussion in just a moment after we hear from Mike and Jonathan. So thanks so much for setting that up for us. I will mention real quickly here, I did a similar session like this with another journalist a few weeks ago who works specifically in environmental justice, Brianna Draxler, who's the environmental editor at Yes. And she said that every environmental story right now should be and must be an environmental justice story. And I thought that was such a great way to frame it, especially for those of us who are journalism adjacent and aren't being forced to actually reckon with all of that. All right, I'm going to move on to Mike Disoccio, who's a freelance journalist based in upstate New York and tells stories about cities, climate change, and the LGBTQ+ community. Mike has worked as an editor, photographer, and reporter, and his work has been published in Bloomberg, The Guardian, Fortune, Big Boston, The Huffington Post, Bicycling Magazine, and more. Mike, please tell us more.
Sure, thanks, Lainey. Hi, everyone. My name is Mike. Like Lainey said, I'm a freelance journalist and got my start in journalism kind of reluctantly, actually. My brother strongly suggested that I join my high school newspaper because apparently that's what the smart kids were doing. And I kind of found the loophole in that by becoming a photographer because I really didn't want to write. And I figured taking pictures was the easy way out. I soon discovered this whole wonderful thing called photojournalism. And actually, the bulk of my early journalism career was photography. So through high school and into college, that's what I focused on. In college, I was, had a couple of internships. I was on the college paper, pretty much all in photography. And it wasn't until my later years of college that I got kind of pulled back into writing. And then as it happened, my first real journalism job right out of college, which was at a business publication here in upstate New York, was as an editor and a writer. So it's been kind of an interesting path in that I've been able to get a taste of almost every part of the newsroom, and my interest in all of those different mediums has always come back to social issues primarily. So I've reported on everything from homelessness to food insecurity to climate, and I'm always drawn to those stories because they feel like a way to really make an impact with the work that I'm doing. So now as a freelancer, I've really been leaning into the idea of solutions journalism because it feels like a lot more productive way to direct that energy. As Lainey said, it's not a feel-good story. It's just as rigorous as any other kind of journalism. You do talk about what the problem is, but then including the solutions piece to me makes it a lot more worthwhile because it can kind of push the conversation forward. So I have been doing more of that work lately, and it's just been really exciting. And my main beats, as Lainey mentioned at the moment, are climate, cities and kind of urbanism, and the LGBT community. So I'm really excited to chat more about all of that today.
Thank you so much, Mike. Last but certainly not least, we have Jonathan Franklin, who's a multi-platform reporter for National Public Radio, that's NPR, covering general assignment and breaking national news in the nation's capital, Washington, D.C. Prior to NPR, he served as a digital multi-skilled journalist for the CBS affiliate in DC. And while at WUSA, he covered and reported on some of the major stories of the last 2 years, including COVID-19 and its impact on the Black and African-American community, DC's racial protests and demonstrations following the death of George Floyd, the 2020 presidential election, and the January 6th insurrection on the US Capitol. And fascinatingly for all of us here today, just in case you hadn't yet gleaned this from the discussions before we officially got started, Jonathan is a Bonner alum. Jonathan, tell us more about yourself.
Thank you, Lainey. So like you said, I'm Jonathan Franklin. I am a multi-platform reporter for NPR. I guess you would say I got my start in journalism when I was in elementary school. I always, like teachers said, like you just talk too much and you're always in everybody's business. And I was like, well, what can I make make myself into a career? Or what can I, use this skill of being inquisitive and being nosy to, make it a career. And so after speaking to, I had a couple of journalists that went to my church and in the community, they're like, oh, you would be such a great future journalist. And so, did the morning news show in elementary school, did the yearbook in middle school, wrote for my high school and college papers, had a bunch of internships in TV, and got my start in the business freelancing for the CW affiliate in DC after grad school, WDCW. So start off behind the camera, doing more producing, line producing. So the producer is the one that kind of makes the show and is in the control room, kind of calls the shots to tell the reporters and anchors kind of sort of not necessarily what to do, because that's what executive producer does, but more so, I'm the one that's kind of controlling the flow of the show for the newscast. So after doing that for maybe a year and a half, I was like, don't mind seeing myself in front of the camera. I hate the sound of my voice, which is coincidentally, I work at NPR and it's all video. So you gotta have to deal with it. So I was a television reporter for about 3.5 years until I jumped to radio, thinking radio isn't that bad. And radio and television have their sort of similarities. Covered pretty much everything under the sun. I've covered, protests in DC. I've covered the pandemic, especially the impact on African Americans and Indigenous people. I covered the insurrection. I was actually live on the grounds when protesters stormed the Capitol. We were live on air, and I was one of the reporters that was actually on the ground. So that was another story for another day. But I've covered pretty much anything from crime, journal assignment, local news, national news, etc. But now I have a focus on race and culture, and also developing a new series at NPR, focusing on missing persons, but also missing persons pertaining to African Americans, Black and Brown people, Indigenous people, etc. So kind of taking that focus in what has been the talk of the Gabby Petito case and that coverage, and kind of shifting it on how we can also, in the words of applying that same energy to marginalized groups who don't oftentimes get the same news coverage. So that's what I've kind of been doing at NPR. I've used my Bonner experience, focusing on social justice, focusing on race and culture and ethnicity. When I was doing at my service, I also interned at the Bonner Foundation as well. So using those experiences to kind of propelled me to shift my focus as a reporter and as a correspondent to talk about a lot of these open dialogue discussions that are sort of kind of taboo or kind of uncomfortable, but kind of want to bring it to the table saying, hey, people are talking about this, we need to address this. Here's a platform that we can use to further elevate the conversation.
Thank you, Jonathan. My little dog is barking. I deeply apologize to everyone. I'm throwing bribery bacon treats at her. Hazards of living in Brooklyn and working from home. Okay, so we want this to be really interactive. We want this to be useful to all of the students who are here on the call. So I will say, especially if you are an upperclassman and you are working on any sort of capstone service-oriented project, please start thinking about questions you have for our participants. We will have people monitoring the chat. So if you feel uncomfortable speaking up, you can write those questions down and drop them for us in the chat, and we will pull them out. Or you can either raise your hand on the screen, use the little React raise your hand, or just shout it out if there's a lull in the conversation. Really, the more the merrier. We would love to hear your questions. But I will get us started. I will kick us off. So I know that food insecurity, as Layla hopefully brought up for us, it's a big theme right now with a lot of the service work that the Bonner Foundation is doing. And not coincidentally, we planned it this way. Both Mike and Layla have done work in solutions toward hunger and food insecurity. I did drop some of that work in the chat if you wanted to pull it up and take a quick look at it. But just to kind of get us started, if you don't want to have to mess with opening extra links and text right now, Mike and Layla, I would like for you both to talk to us a little bit about those solutions you found on community solutions to food insecurity, and whether you think they have potential to be implemented on a larger scale. And if yes, how and why?
Mike, do you want to go first?
Sure. So the solution that I wrote about for Yes Magazine was free food fridges. So I centered the story in Albany, New York, which is where I live, but the free food fridge movement, it's kind of a mouthful, is international and has been around for kind of a long time. It became a lot more popular during the pandemic. So I'm sure a lot of you saw on Instagram, in major cities all over the country, these fridges started popping up as a way to kind of address a problem that was only getting worse. Food insecurity has certainly been around for a long time, but a lot of the data shows that the economic insecurity that came along with the pandemic pushed a lot of people into hunger. And so these fridges popped up as a solution to that, and I came around to the story about a year and a half into the pandemic, which kind of was a time to step back and assess like, okay, is this working? What I found was that it does certainly serve kind of like a short-term need. You know, these fridges are emptied out like just as quickly as they're filled. They are feeding a lot of people. There's not a lot of hard evidence on them because they're sort of anonymous by design, right? The whole point is you don't have to go to, you know, a food pantry or go through some kind of social service application. You can just go open the fridge and take what you need, which is very much the power in the solution, but it's also what limits our ability to measure it. So, you know, when you talk to people who are doing this, they say, yes, it's feeding people, obviously, but they're also really quick to admit that it's kind of a band-aid because a lot of the deeper causes of food insecurity, you know, are economic, they're structural, they're not going to be solved by having a bunch of fridges on the side. So one of the most powerful aspects of the solution I found in the reporting is actually its power to raise awareness. So a few people told me that, you know, just seeing a fridge in your community kind of alerts you to the fact that people are struggling, which you might not have otherwise thought about, and then might kind of increase interest in some of the more structural solutions that actually need to take place here. And so the story ended up, I mean, that's not the point that I thought I would end up at the story. I thought it would be, you know, kind of like, oh yeah, the fridges are, you know, solving a problem and that's the end. But like I said, people were actually very, very upfront with its limitations and how it's kind of most of its power lies in symbolism than its actual ability to feed people. So that's kind of the general overview of what I found. And in terms of its scaling, you know, I think it did scale very much during the pandemic. But again, I think everyone who's running these programs would say that, you know, scaling the fridges is not really where most of our efforts should be going. We should be thinking in a bigger picture.
That perfectly encapsulates two of my favorite things about solutions journalism, which is one, that talking about the limitations or the drawbacks to a solution makes the entire story stronger. And like you just said, helps people understand the problem in a way that they didn't before. So once we approach things from that solutions first angle, it really opens up different avenues for thinking that we might not have if we were just zoomed in on more traditional ways of thinking about hunger. Leila.
Well, you flagged two of my stories, Lainey. I'll start with one for Civil Eats, which is about food insecurity among college students. And one thing that you start to figure out pretty quickly when you start reporting on food insecurity, yes, there is the root cause, which is poverty, which is an enormous problem to solve, and you can't solve that all at once. Or we could if we had the political will, potentially, but we don't. So we chip away at it in bits and pieces. But the other thing that you figure out about food insecurity when you start reporting on it is that food insecurity and the challenges to getting the assistance you need is not the same for every group. And college students have unique challenges that are different from the very unique challenges of, say, senior citizens or single moms with kids or whoever. And for college students, food insecurity on college campuses has been a growing problem and actually almost a secret problem for a lot of years. And part of the reason is that there's this very upper middle class white concept of what college is and what a college student is. And so when you started having so many students going to college who did not fit that traditional 1950s American idea of who was showing up on campus, they brought all of these other challenges with them. Namely, and the things that administrators who'd been working in colleges and universities were completely surprised by. Things like if they could get a scholarship to pay for college, they still might have some money that they would have to pay for tuition and books, and that didn't leave enough money for food. And so college food pantries started popping up on campuses. And that might sound like a great idea, and even some of these college pantries had things. There's one community college in Brooklyn, Kingsborough Community College, that had a community garden that would give away free food twice a week. Sounds like a great idea, but then part of the issue there is that you have students leaving campus and going to jobs or going to take care of a family member, and they can't put a bunch of carrots in their backpack and get it home in any kind of reasonable shape to want to cook with it. So there are all of these issues. And so The pandemic did highlight a lot of issues and extra issues for college students, namely, what do you do when students leave campus and they don't have access to the college food pantry, whether or not that was useful for them. And so part of the issue was really, how do we get more students enrolled in SNAP? And this was a question that had been on the minds of folks who deal with college students and food insecurity for a while. There was a big gap in the number of college students who were eligible for SNAP and the number of college students who were enrolling for SNAP, which is widely considered to be a benefits program that really works. And the pandemic really highlighted some of the challenges and some of the need for this, namely that college students have to work 20 plus hours a week in order to be eligible for SNAP. If you were part-time, you couldn't get SNAP. If you were, at a trade school, you couldn't get SNAP. So there were waivers issued by the USDA to cover that during the pandemic. And as a result, SNAP enrollments actually went up, which works, right? That actually really works. That's actually giving people money to buy food, which alleviates all kinds of other needs that people have, because it's not just food insecurity. You're not just in need of food. You also have to pay bills, and you have a hard time juggling what needs to be paid. So that helped, and then a significant way to help students get enrolled in SNAP, as it turned out, was having peer-to-peer mentors. And there were a number of programs at different campuses and different colleges, including CUNY here in New York City, 2 massive initiatives to get student mentors trained to reach out to their peers and help guide them, because that was one of the barriers for SNAP access to college students, was the confusion over what had to happen, how tricky it is. It's an opaque system, and there are all kinds of other little bits and pieces that are really hard to understand. And so I think one of the really interesting things in terms of dealing with food insecurity these days is that suddenly we have a lot of people studying and entering this whole suite of careers who have experienced food insecurity themselves. And that completely changes the mindset of how they are helping other people access SNAP and other federal benefits programs and other things that they need. So yes, I think that is scalable. A lot of colleges are thinking about how to improve their pantries, how to reach out to students. Another interesting method is to look at someone's FAFSA, their financial aid form, and if they're getting financial aid, to reach out to those students automatically and say, hey, we see that you need financial aid. Can we help you enroll in SNAP if you're willing to do that? So there are all these sort of creative workarounds now that we understand that college students are not who we once thought they were, and how can we help? The other story seems like a little bit of a less obvious sort of connected thing to food insecurity, and it has to do with, for NCIA, food waste in elementary and high school cafeterias. It's abysmal there, like it is everywhere. At least 40% of food gets dumped. Kids don't want to eat this stuff. How can you do that? And, fix that. And what it has to do with food insecurity, actually. And this is kind of a thorny topic. Not everybody wants to talk about the emergency feeding system, but I'm actually working on a piece about this right now. And food banks and pantries, whatever you want to say about the necessity of these things during the pandemic, they really did help. Whether we want to rely on emergency food networks for solving food insecurity is another question for another time. But one thing that I learned from Feeding America just today, actually, on some interviews, was that they really see food waste as something that can provide more food to folks who need it. So if they can figure out how to take fresh produce that might be otherwise dumped, that's still perfectly serviceable and delicious, and get that into the charitable feeding network, then you're actually helping to tackle not only food insecurity, but nutrition insecurity too. And if you can build up the infrastructure to keep this stuff cold, like refrigerated trucks to ship it to a food pantry, and on-site cooling storage, cooling places so that you can get it to families still in good shape, you've provided not only food that people want to eat and that will help them get through a tough time, but you've also helped sort of tackle nutrition insecurity too, which is a parallel and almost bigger conversation now than food insecurity that we're starting to have. Is that scalable? Absolutely. USDA provided $1 billion to build up the charitable food system, including about $400 million to do things like connect farmers and things having to do with, food waste scenarios to food banks, and also to help build up that infrastructure. There's a new bill in California that makes it illegal to send certain kinds of food to landfills because they're trying to cut down on methane emissions. And so apparently food banks already, as a result of this new law, are seeing a real uptick in donations in healthy proteins and fresh fruits and vegetables. So yeah, seems to be working so far.
There's so much amazing information in that response. And just a reminder to our entire audience that at any point you're welcome to drop questions and comments in the chat. Don't feel like you're interrupting. We will get to them all. But the part that most, I think, sticks out in my mind is that phrase you used about secret problems that we either don't really realize that are there, or that people don't want to think about, or a hidden dimension, or some of all three, maybe at some points. So I am curious, for all of you, all three of you really, how do you go about finding solutions to talk about when problems themselves, which are maybe the more obvious angle to report on, are hard to find? And when there's so much general like hopelessness and malaise about being able to make social progress. So how do you find solutions to report on? And how, if it is it at all different than the kind of work that like Jonathan, for example, is doing with like breaking news on a more regular basis?
Well, I mean, for the most part, I would say, sorry, Mike, sorry.
No, go ahead, Layla.
I don't necessarily, sometimes solutions come to me. I get pitched a lot of stories, which is really cushy, right? Like not have to look for a story is excellent. And I love it when I get pitches from different places that have like that crossover. I'm like, woohoo, like maybe a series, maybe a mini series. But often I actually don't go looking for the solution. I look at the problem, and I think it's just really important to always ask, some of that stuff you were talking about in the beginning, Lainey, what's working and why, what isn't working, what are the challenges? Like, these are all systems that we're talking about, right? So these are questions that as journalists, we should be asking sort of across the board. With news, it's a little different, obviously. In my days of news, I wasn't necessarily asking those questions. But, this is what we really need to talk about, right? To highlight the fact that it's not necessarily black and white. And that's, the word solution can make it seem like, oh yeah, we just have to change our one little thing over here, we're just going to tweak it. But the truth is, especially with food systems, we're talking about systems and interconnected systems, and they're really, really complicated. And trying to sort of drive that home for readers, that's what I'm trying to do. Like, don't look for the black and white solution. Let's sort of start untangling this and seeing where the overlap is and the complexity.
Yeah, I would say that sometimes where I find solution stories is like just this weird belief that I have that like someone somewhere has probably figured this out. Like whenever I see a problem that's local or that's like specific, I'm like, okay, well, this specific problem has not been solved yet, but like I bet a similar problem has been solved somewhere. So like an example of that is I wrote a story recently. I was thinking about like, okay, with climate change, we have to decarbonize basically everything. We have to stop using fossil fuels. Great. A big source of that is housing and buildings. And like buildings have heating systems and appliances that use a ton of fossil fuels. And now as a homeowner, I was like, I don't have all this money to change over all that stuff. And I bet most other people don't. So like, how do we figure this out? I bet someone's figuring this out. And I ended up landing on a solution actually right in my backyard here, which as a city just recently created a $100 million program to basically fund like thousands of buildings to decarbonize. And it's the first in the country to do something like that. And seems like it's going to be, really effective. So, that purely just came out of my own curiosity of like, who's doing this better? And someone was doing it better. So I kind of found it that way.
Jonathan, I'm going to pull you on this one too. So I know Solutions is not Jonathan's beat. He's being very gracious with us in this discussion, but I know you do a lot of work, as you mentioned at the top of the hour, on Black and Brown communities. And I'm curious if you have any strategies on pushing for angles and stories that will include voices that in America especially have historically not been supported or prioritized.
Yeah, so kind of like what Layla and Mike were saying, Solutions, given, breaking news and, the beats that I cover, sometimes there's a solution for it. Sometimes depending on like the angle or the specific topic, there may be a solution. Like what Layla said, it doesn't, I don't go searching for like, oh, like, let me go, get my Rolodex and go on my phone and try to like find people like, oh, who can like find a solution. It's more so either where I'm like doing the story and, the person, the subject that I'm interviewing will say, oh, we know this one person that's doing similar work. And I'm like, oh, wait, like, tell me more. And I'm like having a mic and like, tell me more. So, they kind of get that sort of angle, but oftentimes, it's, kind of doing and kind of studying and doing your own homework. So for instance, I did a story about, and it's actually timely, about the supply chain. So, given supply chain issues that are, taking across, not even like, domestically, but also internationally. And, things like gasoline, things that, electronics, like everything is basically either the prices are going up or there's a shortage or you won't get it in time for Christmas. So I, was doing a story about that. And I said, what's the interesting angle that I can have that separates us from, and, working in a network newsroom, you're like, well, how can we make ourselves different in CNN and ABC and CBS and Fox and, different, large platforms. So I came across this high school in California that is training high school seniors to be truck drivers. So there's a truck driver shortage in, across the country and even internationally. And, we're saying, oh, well, we're not going to get our things on time. And, truck drivers are quitting because of the pandemic. What can we do? Even though, hiring, giving, preparing 18-year-olds to, go across the country to drive, your essential goods may not be a solution, but it's helping to alleviate the problem at hand. So that's one specific, I guess, like route that I, kind of made it into like, oh, it's timely. Here's something that we can do and incorporate, different students that is like, not your average high school students, like, oh, this one person is thinking about, not going to college, but is thinking about making truck driving a career. I didn't know that truck drivers make six figures. If you're interested in doing that, look at my story. But truck drivers are starting out making six figures. That wasn't something that I was taught growing up. It's more so like, okay, like go to college, get a major in something, get a career. But it's like, exploring different avenues. But in my coverage, talking, about, things for Black and Brown communities, particular within the series that I'm doing at NPR about missing persons, it's sort of, having to think about the larger audience and kind of having that more so like a human interest angle that will kind of reel people in to understand why this is important. Because theoretically, when you think about missing white women, you think about, Gabby Petito, you think about Lacey Peterson, you think about John Benet Ramsey, you think about, the typical, big, large, highlights that have been, for decades, but incorporating the Black and Brown angle to more so like, okay, this could be somebody else's child. This can be your neighbor. This can be, your classmate. This can be somebody that but they aren't getting the same media attention. So kind of having that sort of like human interest angle to kind of reel people in is what I try to do best in my work. Working at NPR, you can kind of, persuade people to talk more because it's not on camera. But when I was working in local TV, people oftentimes get scared of the camera. I'm like, don't look at the camera. We're having a conversation. Like, this is just a recording device, but we're going to have a conversation. Don't mind the photographer, or if I'm doing it by myself, don't mind the camera. It's fine. Let's just have a conversation because this is an important subject. So working in different mediums sort of help you, or different platforms sort of help you kind of, can get the story across. And I see that working in radio versus television, but it, like I said, it depends on the subject matter, it depends on, who you're talking to. Oftentimes find that most communities of color don't really trust local news, which I find that is a pretty sad thing, but, given the climate we were previously in for media, things have changed, but most communities of color don't trust their local news. So having to try to like break that barrier, just be like, hey, I'm a journalist, you can trust me, I'm an everyday person, but I'm trying to, help you get your story across.
That's such a great point. I work a lot in this position I'm currently in with college students who have never had a chance to interact with a media professional of any sort. So I might be bringing them the first journalist they've ever interacted with. And a really frequent response that I hear, it's just a general sense of confusion about why people care about the news, an assumption that in fact it's not for them, like you just said, Jonathan, and they don't really understand why people care about it. So I love this chance to bring the news to people where they are, for exactly that reason that you pointed out, like truck driver making six figures. Like I that's not something that I would ever know on my own in my everyday life, and the news brings that information to me, and I love that so much. So thinking about these difficulties of communities that like are or are not willing to participate in news, especially in news of solutions, and the disconnect between people who feel comfortable talking to news and people who are actively working inside their communities, especially given that, Leila, you said you get a lot of good like pitches. So I am curious to hear what makes a good pitch, whether it's especially if it's a solution story, but even if it's not. So for all of our Bonner Foundation audience right now, we've got all these amazing students who are really poised to become leaders in their communities. And ideally, the media can help get those change efforts out into the world. So how do they effectively communicate with the media? What makes a good pitch? How can they collaborate with media professionals to get those change efforts out into the world?
Well, I'll tell you about my favorite pitch that resulted in a story for Civil Eats. And it wasn't a PR pitch, which is very refreshing, although there's some great publicists out there who do send me lots of great stories, including lots of publicists at colleges and universities who actually read what I write and send me something targeted, which is like mind-blowing. Anyway, so it was a pitch actually from a professor at UC Fullerton in California, which had this really unique kind of like very complicated program. So in their town, there was a home for foster kids, and then foster kids age out of the system at 18 unless there's like a support system to help them. And, you know, I have a daughter in college who's 18 and she doesn't know how to return a pair of shoes. You know, I mean, yeah, she's technically a grown-up, but, you know, and she's grown up in a supportive home with two parents and, you know, has had a lot of, you know, a real good base of, you know, home for her life. And so, you know, foster students, and I'd like to do actually a lot more stories on the foster care system because it's just like, there's so much to talk about there. Anyway, it was a program that was for foster students who had actually aged out of the system. And there was a woman who had a home for them and also a cafe where they learned how to cook food. But then at UC Fullerton has this amazing arboretum, and they had started a farm there. And so they had the foster kids come and learn how to work on the farm. And then they did this whole educational component where they would go into the classroom and do nutritional analysis and then take it back to the cafe and cook it and serve it. And it was amazing, right? It was amazing. And part of the reason it was amazing is because we don't talk enough about the foster care system. And, you know, this is one of these stories where when you start talking to kids, and I was doing Zoom interviews, I knew that across the country, not being able to meet them face to face, first time talking to a journalist, it was going to be really weird to have a phone call. And so I did Zoom meetings with them just to be able to look them in the eye and for them to be able to see that I was like an actual human and to be able to show my smiling face and to look encouraging, and had amazing conversations with them and really learned a lot about the foster care system that made me want to do more. I've got to figure that out. But that was an example of a story that I absolutely love, totally about food and yet about the complexity of, you know, how it affects the lives of other people. And actually, you know, food and the food system sort of generally, including restaurants, including, you know, other food service jobs, it's traditionally been a place for a lot of disadvantaged folks to find work. It's a pretty open sort of place to find, and this goes to find a job and to find a career, actually, not just a job, a dead-end job that's not paying even minimum wage, but, you know, to find careers. I do a lot of reporting also on folks who have been justice involved, and this is a place that a lot of justice involved folks wind up and get training in through many, many organizations. So I love a story that, talk about a solution, right? Like giving a real foundation to this group of people that we don't talk enough about in the media. Most people, unless they have gone through the foster care system or are somehow involved with it otherwise, don't know enough about it and don't know enough about the challenges. And so that was a great story. Also because it was complicated. There were so many working parts, and I loved being able to sort of dissect.
I would say for me, I'm someone who rarely takes pitches, I gotta be honest. And that's mostly because I rarely get good ones. Like most of what lands in my inbox is publicists who are sending a pitch to like their entire list of journalists, which to me, I most of the time don't even read those. So like, if I'm gonna read a pitch, it has to be, addressed to me specifically, and also has to be like specific to what I cover. So like, if you get through the door in that sense, then like what I'm really looking for are also very specific solutions. Like, I think a lot of the big things have already been well covered, and I don't feel the need to like, rehash, these really big or obvious or well covered things. So like, if you're going to send me, just to reference the Ithaca example again, that was not a pitch, but if it was, and someone pitched me and said like, Ithaca, a very specific place, is doing this thing where they're raising private equity to decarbonize buildings, like, cool, I've never heard of that before. It's extremely specific. So I think like that's the word for me for pitches, is just the more specific, the better.
Yeah, I would say like when, what Mike just said, I get a lot of pitches, from publicists who are, trying to send it to their whole email chain. And, specifically, I may get a couple, random pitches and people don't spell my first name correctly. They'll spell it John. I'm like, oh, already turned off. Nope. Like, and it's just, to make it personable, like, what Leah just dropped in the chat, to make it, understand, now I work in radio, but beforehand, when you're pitching something to me, now that I work in television, I work in television, what's going to be something that is visually appealing for, viewers and even for readers, because we have the digital version as well. So what can be visually appealing? Also, if it's something that's community driven, that would really resonate well with viewers, because they're trying to find or, read about stuff that's in their community, or how it's, something's in their backyard, or, something that, like that's in the neighborhood across the street, like, that could, happen over here, or vice versa. So making it more, studying the journalists, if you're, going to pitch, say for me, if you're going to pitch something, understand now that I cover national news, it can be, a blanket of race, entertainment, television, etc. Know that I don't have a specific beat just yet, but if it's something like, hey, my, daughter has been missing for 4 weeks and it has not gotten media attention, I'm like, oh, red flag, sirens going up, like that immediately will grab my attention. Also, just, to try to find, like, if you're trying to find pitches, networking is the very best advice I can give. I saw a lot of, entry-level journalists or, students who want to become journalists to this network. A lot of good stories that I've done early on in my career have been from networking, whether that's, going to brunch in DC, or whether I've gone to a networking event, or whether it's from like an alumni event, or even Bonners. I've gotten pitches from Bonner alums that I've, come in contact from Bonner Congress or SLI, or like different Bonner events that, we've kept in touch over the years, that they will pitch me stuff like, hey, my foundation's working on this. I think this is something you'd be interested in. Do more research on like, oh, this is good, and end up covering the story. So keep contact over the years for some of your resources and some of your connections, because you never know that could turn into either a source, or that can turn into a story that somebody can help you out along the way.
Yeah, so specificity really kind of is emerging to me here as a sort of a uniting theme across a lot of this advice, being really comfortable in understanding what your own like unique value add is as a professional, as an advocate, whatever it might be, understanding how your project is like a unique contributor and how it differs than other projects in similar areas, being able to define it either by technology or by region or whatever its most distinctive feature might be, which is all great advice. Again, like I said in the chat, even beyond reporting, if you're in any kind of field where you really need to be talking to other people professionally, Yeah, exactly. You have to be able to do all of those things. So I think it's a great thing for everyone here to be thinking about yesterday, immediately, as soon as possible. I'm gonna flip that question onto the reverse. So we've just talked about how people can approach you and what best practices are for that. I'm gonna flip it and ask how you approach other people, especially since everyone here on this call with me works in some way with like diverse populations, with minoritized populations, with vulnerable or at-risk populations, people who may not be the most outgoing and who stand a lot to lose by talking to strangers, by putting themselves in at-risk positions. So again, since all of our students here are people who are strongly invested in social change efforts, do you have any advice for all of us on how to approach community members who might be different? I'm a white woman, right? So like if I'm approaching someone who is a person of color, or if we're approaching people who are a gender minority, who are LGBT, who are low socioeconomic status, how can we uplift those people, make them feel comfortable, and not be exploitative or extractive?
As also a white woman, oh, sorry, Mike, I keep jumping on you.
So one thing I would say is I think Solutions is a huge help in this area. Like I'm guilty of, like, as a white person especially, doing that extractive type of journalism in my past. And I think Solutions has helped me approach it in a really different way because, you know, I'm not out to get you. I'm not out to just like give all this attention to your problems. I'm not here to just like, you know, make you a pity story. Like I'm actually trying to kind of advance this conversation and show maybe what you're doing to help, or, you know, what your community is doing to help. So, you know, in the example, the free fridge story, like not only had free fridges been covered extensively, but Jamela Anderson, the Black woman who founded it in Albany, had been like covered by every local publication. She was in Time magazine before I got to her. So like she had every reason to just be like done with the press. A lot of those stories weren't great and she was probably pretty unhappy with them. But I don't think any one of those stories, you know, used solutions journalism as a lens. And I think explaining that up front definitely helped kind of get my foot in the door with her. And, you know, when the finished product came out, she, you know, really, really loved it and was super satisfied with how she was represented, which, you know, my goal as a journalist is not to make people look good necessarily, but it's really gratifying when I get that kind of feedback because I know that I did that person justice. So that would be, you know, my 2 cents about it is just like, really lean into the solutions angle because I think it gives people more dignity than the other strategy, which is, you know, just to lavish all this attention on their problems.
I'd also say that one thing I've learned over the years, and it's been a lot of years more than I'm willing to actually admit here today, is that a lot of people don't really know what it's like to talk to a member of the press, right? Like that's a pretty new thing. And a little bit scary, and they're kind of afraid. And so again, it's sort of like talking to the students on Zoom to make sure they could see my face and to answer any questions that they had before we chatted. I tell them about the story that I'm working on. I tell them why I want to tell their story, that it will help other people, you know, to connect. People who don't know anything about their situation understand better by being able to connect it to real people, and people who are in their situation to know that there are other folks like that who will talk about this and maybe see these connections for themselves. I'm also really careful to tell people up front, I'm going to ask you some personal questions. If you don't want to answer them, you absolutely don't have to answer them. Anything that makes you feel uncomfortable, just tell me and we'll drop it. We can do this at whatever pace and however you need to. I'm here to listen. And then I always make sure to thank them for trusting me with their story. So, and then coming back later, because there's inevitably fact checking, which really freaks people out who haven't dealt with the press before. And to make sure that I just explain step by step what I'm doing and why, and to be available for questions and forthcoming and slow.
Yeah, I like to kind of sort of like what Mike and, you know, Leila were saying, make it more personable in a sense. So, you know, if I've covered plenty of crime stories in DC, obviously the nation's capital is very diverse. You have a very large groups of people in different pockets across DC, Maryland, and Virginia. You know, I will, you know, walk on a scene, or I'll walk, you know, just in a neighborhood, And, I'll talk, try to, have conversations. I'm a very personable person. Ari and Bobby can probably tell you all that I was very much the chatterbox at the Honor Foundation, just kind of getting lunch with everybody and kind of, seeing their story, because I'm just a very inquisitive person. So to be able to kind of just like sit down and just have conversations with people. And then, obviously I would tell them like, hey, my name is Jonathan Franklin. I work for WSA. Just tell me about what happened over here. This spark a conversation. I don't, when I was working in television and also now working in radio, I don't, immediately, go up to them with the camera or with the microphone saying, hey, I'm with the media, like, tell me about what's happening. I'm more so you have the conversation and be like, oh, can you hold that thought? Like, would you be interested in doing this on camera? Kind of like setting the stage so they're not feeling overwhelmed. One instance that I can tell you that actually helped me out in our station in comparison to the competition, there was a deadly shooting in one of the most, the rougher part of DC. And of course, the competition state, the competing stations will just do what I like to say, this reporting. They'll tell you like the press release version, like this is what happened at this time, this is what happened at this date, this many people got hurt. I was like, well, how can I make this different in a way that makes us stand out? So I walked, just walking around the neighborhood, and I said, walked to a group of guys at a barbershop, and I said, hey, you saw what happened. Tell me what happened. And then they're like, oh, what story are you going to tell? I'm like, the story that you want me to tell. So just tell me what happened. So made it more of a personable angle, which ended up giving our team an Emmy nomination for that, that coverage, because it's like it made us different. And we actually did storytelling versus actual reporting. So if you have like a story to tell, and kind of so you can, weave in the important updates, so like, oh, this has happened, the X amount of time in the nation's capital, or the X amount of time this week, or in this neighborhood, you can still like weave in the important facts, but more so to have a story to tell, because it impacts the community. Another thing that I also do whenever I, have a conversation, of course, you ask the important questions like, oh, can you say and spell your first and last name for me? Where are you from? I also ask the question now, what are your pronouns? Because oftentimes, you may be, male, female, but you may go by they, them, theirs, or you may go by, she, whatever. So I like to, set the stage and make it more comfortable, because obviously I'm writing a script. I have to track it for TV. I have to track it for radio. If I have to go back and retrack it, and because I got your pronouns messed up, that obviously takes a lot of time, but also I want to get it right the first time, because you don't want to, disrespect somebody when you're telling their story.
Yeah, there's definitely so many different angles and ways and levels to be considerate of people that automatically is just going to make them feel much more included, and like the news, like the reporting is for them, like it's inclusive of them. I think without getting us off on too much of a tangent here, that the loss of so many local newspapers has really had a huge impact on this, because so many people didn't get to see like their local neighborhood news reporter anymore, because those papers just don't exist. Which is why, like I said in the chat, I really recommend getting on Twitter specifically is the best place that I've found to just be able to really listen to reporters talk about the work that they're actually doing, kind of get it straight from the source. So the youths, if you're not, I know Twitter is not the most popular amongst the youths, but it is a great place to actually be able to do some of that networking that all of our journalists here were speaking about. All right, we're at the 2/3 mark, and I can Will ask questions all day long, but I'm going to take yeah, Mike, you're right. I'm gonna take a step back and just make a little bit of an open space right now for our audience. Is there anything you want to ask our speakers? Like, it can be related to anything we have already talked about. If you're working on some sort of advocacy project right now and you want to get some fresh ears on it, now is the time. If you have writing and research questions, now is the time. If you want to ask Jonathan about how the Bonner experience has served him, now is the time. I'm giving you a moment before I jump back in here and take over.
Well, I want that question. Jonathan, how has the Bonner experience served you?
Well, I would say, like, given, us as Bonners working in different capacities with different groups, with different, nonprofits, with, it kind of opened up my eyes to think outside of the box. Where I went to school, Wofford College, is in upstate South Carolina. We like to joke around and say like Wofford has its own little bubble. So like people outside the bubble don't, understand Wofford, and Wofford students don't really understand what's going on outside of the parameters of 429 Church Street in Spartanburg. So given, my experience as a Bonner, it allowed me to think outside of the box, to think locally, and to have like a global perspective on issues that I would approach. And even a lot of the times with my coursework, Wofford's a liberal arts institution. So combining my Bonner experience with the liberal arts thinking kind of allowed me to challenge my perspective and also my classmates' perspective, because, we will talk about community issues in, a specific class. And I would say, oh, at my Bonner service side, I was doing this, this, and this. And, working with different people to, bring that different perspective, kind of like a full circle moment, saying like, oh, I'm volunteering, I'm doing this, I'm learning about this in class. How can I combine the two to make it sort of not really like, I guess, solutions in a sense, but more so how can I make the best of both worlds to, understand and take these things outside of the classroom and apply them. So my experiences as a Bonner, like working in different, capacities, different service sites, studying a lot of the issues inside and outside of the classroom, allow me to kind of frame what I wanted to do as a journalist. I didn't want it just to be the regular local news reporter that just kind of like reported the news and did this and did that and anchoring. I wanted to make an impact and to have an impact in my community, and also to tell stories that oftentimes didn't get told. When volunteering at my service site, I heard and saw and witnessed a lot of things. I was like, wow, this would make a good story. But if only if I was a journalist, that taking those different perspectives and those different experiences and applying them and know like, okay, I can reach out to the Urban League, or I can reach out to, this specific nonprofit to, get a different perspective for a piece that I'm working on. So I've worked on several, civil rights pieces and several, issues that combine about, with race and culture, knowing that I can tap into the Urban League's resources or the NAACP or different avenues for race and culture. If I didn't sort of have that experience as a Bonner, I wouldn't really know who to turn to get like a second or scholastic or different point of view outside of the general thinking that like we were taught in journalism school, like, oh, get both sides of the story, get this, but how can you incorporate a different angle to make your reporting or your storytelling stand out to reach not just the homepage or just, social media, but also reach the communities for those who might not have internet access or might not have, English might not be their first language, or different communities that can really use the storytelling that you're telling.
Liz gave us a question in the chat. She says she'd love to hear what you all see for the future of journalism, particularly in this age of distrusting the news, #fake news, in terms of finding and sharing solutions.
That's a rough one, man. I don't know.
I will, I'll give you an extra second to mull it over, and I will make a momentary plug here for Solutions Journalism to say that that actually is one of the demonstrated findings SJN finds when we partnered with a couple firms to do some research on the impacts of solutions journalism. And we do find that it reduces polarization and makes people feel like they have a better ability to talk about the issues. So it fights back against that idea of the news being unreliable, and it creates a better ability to discuss issues.
I just also want to say, I don't think that the news is going anywhere. I don't think that journalism is going anywhere. We're re-evolving again and again and again, like endlessly. We're going to be here. It's going to look different. I mean, I still buy the Sunday New York Times because I find that it's the least stressful way to actually consume news, to be able to page through something and at my leisure and not have to listen to all of the other people, like all the freak out like on Twitter and wherever about people analyzing every story and being angry. Anyway, there's all kinds of folks who are doing journalism through, independent means, and, you subscribe to a newsletter and you can do it that way. But I don't know what it's going to look like. I'm not sure, but I think it's still going to be here, and we'll see. I think we're in a cycle of distrust for sure. It's definitely not the first time people have distrusted the media. That's like a given. It's really bad now, but
yeah, I think one of the things I think about a lot, one of my professors in college used to say that like people have a temptation to think of like the good old days of journalism, quote unquote, as like, 70s and 80s when like they were just printing money and like, all these big investigative teams, whatever. But he always made a point of calling those the bad old days because, that was also the time when like newsrooms were super sexist and like, it was like the white male gaze for everything. So I think while it's really challenging in journalism right now when it comes to like finding jobs, finding funding, newsroom budgets, all of that, all those problems are very, very real. But on the other hand, I think like we're kind of like the best version of ourselves that we've ever been, in the sense of like the ambition of reporters and the awareness of a lot more social justice issues, of intersectionality, of realizing that like, you know, it shouldn't all come from the white male gaze. You know, there was this great quote about like how like objectivity at the New York Times really meant like the view from like Montclair, New Jersey, because that's where like the white men at the New York Times worked, right? So like I think we're having all of these really important conversations now, and really like I said, growing into like the best version of journalism that there ever has been. I just wish that the, you know, the funding and the public trust and all that would kind of come back along with it.
I will say that, you know, what Layla said, that news is always going to be there, whether you like it or not, whether you pay for the New York Times, Washington Post, LA Times, Atlanta Journal-Constitution, USA Today, it's always going to be there. I do think, however, that the way we consume news is shifting more to a digital platform. So I've had, you know, friends that have been, you know, we were in school together, they are TV reporters, they're trying to get to the network level in a sense to, you know, be like a correspondent for, you know, ABC News, NBC News, CBS, et cetera. But they're finding out that streaming services are a lot of where to get a lot of the news. So like NBC News Now, 24-hour streaming service. You can turn it on at 3 o'clock in the morning. There'll be anchors still reading. There'll be reporters, you know, correspondents around the world delivering the news, because oftentimes millennials don't have cable. I feel like I'm the one millennial that has cable, and it's because I like to watch a lot of reality television. But a lot of millennials don't have cable, or they don't, you know, subscribe to, you know, the Washington Post or the New York Times. So you're kind of having to meet them in a sense of like, okay, well, I have a subscription digitally to the New York Times. I can look at it on my smartphone, or, oh, you know, I have Apple TV or Roku. Well, let me download the CBS News app and let me get it that way. So we're having to finesse our way of thinking to get our news to a larger audience. And that's because of streaming and digital platforms, because people are, you know, cutting the cable cord, or they're like, oh, well, somebody stole my Washington Post newspaper. Like, I guess I don't have it this Sunday. So you're having to kind of create different ways to deliver the news. And I will say, one of the best things one of my journalism professors taught me is that, you know, if you are going on an interview to, you know, for a job interview, and you discover that the hiring manager, whether it may be like a white person, et cetera, but oftentimes it's been, you know, white people have been at the top. If you see a lot of, you know, white people in the newsroom and the hiring manager is white, they're trying to either use you as a diversity token, or you're going to be one of probably 2 people in a newsroom. So every time I go on a job interview, whether that's, you know, people approach me for jobs, whether I, you know, seeking out my next adventure, I always ask hiring managers, whether that's the news director, the editor, managing editor, et cetera, what are you doing to support your Black and brown talent? And how are you going to retain your Black and brown talent in order for them to tell stories in these communities that oftentimes aren't getting told? So a lot of people are like, wow, that's a very thoughtful question. But it's like, because I'm a Black man, oftentimes I have to think 2 steps ahead to get, you know, ask these questions in newsrooms. So I will say, you know, 1, from the streaming services, but 2, that newsrooms are shifting to hopefully diversify their newsrooms. And if you diversify your newsrooms, you're diversifying your news coverage. So you're telling stories that oftentimes aren't, like what Mike said, are coming from the white male gaze, but you're bringing a different perspective to challenge the readers, or challenge the viewers, or challenge the listeners to get them to understand your stories that you're telling.
Just one more thing, like to hop onto something Jonathan said, like at the beginning, in terms of what you can do with online journalism, there's some really cool stuff happening now, like mapping tools, and the way that you can use video and photography and do these more like sort of 3-dimensional pieces. It's kind of a hot time for journalism if you think about it that way. There's some really cool stuff happening that that was not possible before, that really drives stories home in a new and really fascinating way.
Even not just on the most basic internet level, the ability to hyperlink inside a story is amazing. That you can take, oh, did you miss part 1 last week? Like, here's the link. Oh, you have a question about this person or this company that we're mentioning in this story. Like, here, you can go learn more about them. Just that has changed the way I interact with reading news stories. Again, so many great things coming out of this, and I want to ask questions about all of them. I'm trying to restrain all of my urges here. So In consideration of our time starting to wind down, and I want to give thanks to our listeners, I would love for you all to tell me what your best tip is for audiences to improve their media consumption. Jen, let's assume like average American, maybe they're like watching some TV news or listening on the radio, but they're not like a really keyed in news consumer. How can they improve their media diet?
I would say diversify your news sources. Don't just look at television 24/7 saying, oh, well, I get my news from Fox News and this is it, or oh, I get my news from NBC. And if NBC didn't report this, then I don't think this is true. I've heard that plenty of times. Or to say like, oh, I only read the New York Times, Washington Post. If it's not in the Post or the Times, it's not true. That's false. I do, in order for me to come up with, in order to stay on top of the news of the day, or just to even, something could be happening internationally, I like to, read the Times, read the Post, watch Fox News, watch MSNBC, look at, BuzzFeed. Oftentimes alongside the quizzes, they do have actual really good news to read, diversify my news sources, because if they're thinking a different way, or they're talking about a different angle that, oh, I've been oftentimes thinking about this, it allows me to bring a different, subject to the table, or different angle, saying, hey, our competitors are doing this. I think we should talk about this, or, oh, they're leaving out this part. So to, not only to stick to one specific platform, medium, or one specific, print, magazine, radio, et cetera, to try to get a different sense of, TV, how people are doing things on TV. You're reading it, or you're listening to it on NPR, or you're reading it online, but getting that actual visual of like, oh, this is what the neighborhood looks like. So kind of diversify your thinking, just to kind of, with that, but diversify your news sources to diversify your thinking, to not just have one specific plain point of view when reading something.
Yeah, I think that's great advice, Jonathan. I would add to just, be really intentional about where you're getting your news. Cause I think it's really easy to just passively consume news on social media, especially. But I try not to really get any of my news that way. I have a list of 25 publications that I have in a Feedly account. Feedly is basically just a site that aggregates for me, so that every morning I check Feedly and I'm getting stuff from national news, local news, radio, digital, print, whatever. It's all coming in there. And, I've chosen all those sources because they're places that I know and trust. And then I can kind of get that, like Jonathan said, diverse array of news every day. So, I just say don't be passive about it. Go out of your way to find sources that you trust and go back to them.
The word passive is what came to my mind too. But in terms of, you don't have to be a passive acceptor of news sources. If you're interested in journalism, you're going to have to get interested in doing research. You can go online and you can figure out who's funding a nonprofit newsroom. You can figure out where the people who are writing for a publication, what kind of background they come from, and if they have an agenda. You can actually get out there and figure out who's telling you the news and if that's news that you want to be hearing or reading.
Valerie is asking for name drops, news sources that people like in the chat. And I will add to that, Valerie, that I think often it's easy to forget that news doesn't have to only mean breaking and or political news. So if you have some sort of special interest, whether it be, food and foodways, or if it's international finance, or if it's European sports car racing, #sports, you can find news on a special topic too, and often find people doing that sort of special interest reporting who can connect it to other topics, right? Especially, I also have a lot of interest in foodways. And like Leila said earlier, there's a lot of really interesting work in food and food journalism happening that connects environmental justice, but also some cultural concerns and cultural issues, diaspora populations. So my point being, you don't have to, if you're someone who's not invested in politics, that doesn't mean that there's no news for you. So lean in to whatever occupies your time otherwise, and I promise that there is a reporter out there somewhere who is producing amazing work on it. You're welcome. All right, should I pull one more question? I was on mute, apologies. How about one more question to finish us out strong here? Let's see. Giving you one more moment. It's now or never.
I have a question. I've talked about this in your answers, but you've mentioned just different ways that your journalism is finding solutions. Like if you had your dream to help us and help the Bonner Network reshape colleges so that more people were being educated to do this kind of solutions oriented work, what would you want to see?
I mean,
Like, and as an example, like earlier, Layla, you talked about people who've been affected by the problem helping to rewrite policies. Like that's an example that I think we're trying to do through community engagement to change how we even think of people getting a degree. But just curious what other things you've seen or would want to see happening in education.
I think that there's possibly, an old style sort of way of teaching about journalism is to teach how to report the news or how to teach write a feature article or how to do a Q&A. I think it's not a bad idea to think about how to tell a story like from your heart. I know we're supposed to be dispassionate, but we certainly are not. And I think that the more invested you are in the stories that you want to tell, the more likely it is you're going to tell them well and want to continue to tell them and develop them over time. So I think we need to talk more about finding something that's not just, oh, interesting, like what's going to sell, but also what are my talents, what are my interests, and how can I lead with that to tell the best stories possible.
That's great, Layla. I'll jump on that for a second just to say, like, some of my favorite work is the work I do about the queer community, and like that's because I'm queer and all of those stories come from my heart. And like I'm still a journalist, I'm still using all my journalistic skills to do that work, but there is a personal connection. There is that kind of deeper level to it. The other thing I would say is just like I would love to see solutions journalism being taught in journalism school, because I graduated college 4 years ago, and not a very long time ago, and we were not learning about solutions journalism at all. I don't know anyone who did reporting like that. Everyone was reporting on problems. It was like just that really old school method. And I love my professors, and I thought I got a great education, but now in hindsight I'm like, oh well, there would have been so much more like learning for me to do if I learned this method back in college. So like I would love to see more journalism schools embrace that.
We are working on it, but students, if you are interested in learning more about solutions journalism, we are always available to come talk to either like a class at university or a college newsroom. I'm going to call on my colleague, Catherine, who's been watching in the audience. Say, Catherine, can you drop the link to like our newsletters for our listeners today?
Yes, we'll do. And I put in the link to the SJN Basic Toolkit, which has like a 30-minute section on storytelling, and it kind of gives an overview of how to do solutions journalism, which none of the reporters on here are going to want to admit that you could write a story after just watching that, but I think you could.
You can, it's true.
And I think so, Mike and really all of you were talking about how one of the good things that's come about in the modern age of journalism is that it's not only grumpy old white straight cishet men producing it. And I think that philosophy also applies to like how you get into the field of journalism. So like I've had students ask me like, oh, well, I don't have like a master's in journalism from Harvard, so I can't be a writer. And that's absolutely not true. Like there's a real need, especially in specialized fields, right? I've gotten that question more than once though. So there's that impression out there, and I'm here to tell you it's not true. You don't need an advanced degree or really any degree in journalism at all. So if you are someone who is, especially like a scientist, like in environmental studies, and you have that expert knowledge and you understand the issues, there's always a need for those experts to be able to communicate well and clearly with the public. Yeah, so if you're interested in writing, but that has been a block for you, like, well, I can't get into writing because I haven't been in writing, like an Ouroboros kind of thing. We are all here to tell you that that is not the case. You don't have to be a journalist to become a journalist.
I was just about to say that. A lot of good journalists that I look up to or admire don't have a specific journalism degree. Like most of them have like an English background, political science, somebody majored in physics. So you just have to, you learn on the go, or you learn through internships. Like my college major was communications. So I didn't have that necessarily like, go to journalism school. I ended up going to journalism school for my master's because eventually I would want to maybe teach solutions journalism, maybe teach race and culture in journalism. Who knows? The world, endless possibilities. But I wanted to have that foundation to eventually teach the future leaders or future journalists. So that's why I went to journalism school. But a lot of my colleagues are like, oh yeah, I have an English degree. Or yeah, I have this is make a like underwater basketball degree. Like they have different majors, but they learn, on the fly, or they learn through just going to newsrooms or having to like real life experience or internships to propel their careers. So if you kind of like look at any biography or any, bio of a journalist that you look up to, oftentimes they will say like, oh, they have a degree in government or a degree in politics or a degree in this, and not a specific journalism degree. Like if you want something that's like specific, like I want to focus on investigative journalism. Like, yes, some people might have a broadcast degree or they might have, a regular degree, but, it's what you make it and what your path is to, get into the industry.
I don't have a question. I think I just been trying to like process of the great information that Jonathan, Mike, and Leah have shared with us. And they were all like stimulating. So I just want to say thank you to the three of you, and of course, Lanny, for this great session. I was enjoying it, so I wasn't thinking about questions, but now I feel like I might have to do my own research and not just listen to NPR all the time, because that's like my car is constantly on NPR. I love public radio. I try to support financially whenever I can public radio. I think
yes, please do.
That's something that I encourage everyone to do on here, because we need it in today's society. So I'm going to follow up with this recording, but I just want to say thank you to you all, especially to Solution Journalism Network, for allowing Lenny to moderate this session. And thank you, Lenny, for putting this together.
Absolutely, my pleasure. I've had such a good time talking with all of our reporters here today. We have exactly 6 minutes allotted remaining. I don't feel need to keep us here until then, but I will say, is there anything that we haven't touched on yet that Jonathan or Mike or Leila would like to leave our listeners with? Doesn't have to be news related.
I'd like to make one quick comment, which is, it's really powerful for me to hear how much in reporting about solutions, how much your work is similar to my work and the work of many folks trying to make the world a better place. And your passion, your curiosity, how you got there, how where you are in that process, how you think about your field, all that stuff it's like a window into a whole nother. I mean, we consume a lot of this stuff, but we don't actually talk to a lot of journalists. And having you right here on the screen, and Lainey, your enthusiasm, the way you present and ask questions, it makes it really fun. Actually, it's very inspiring to me. Not least of all, we have a Bonner grad in the group, but just great. All four of you and Catherine, we've talked in the past, and it sort of brings to life sort of a set of things we've been thinking about. The solutions you're talking about at the top, but these other aspects of how you guys are a part of making this happen. And we're going to record this, we're going to share it across our network, and I think we'll find other opportunities to bring folks like you in front of certainly students and others. Just wonderful. I thought most of this would be just about the solutions around hunger, and I've already been texting people around college financial aid officers helping students enroll in SNAP, right? Come on. Why wouldn't that be done everywhere where students are housing insecure, among other things, you know? And anyway, I just really want to thank, you know, join in thanking you guys for taking the time and for lifting this whole work up.
I just want to say to any students who are listening, presuming you're still here, there's still 25 people participating. Journalism's really fun. And probably Jonathan, Mike, and I all have different reasons why we think it's fun, but I get up every day psyched that I get to talk to people. I'm actually an introvert, which is hard to believe, I know, but I really, really love to talk to people and to learn about their stories and to figure out how to tell them. I love to take pictures too. I don't do enough of that. I'm looking to do more of that this year and into the future. But you know, find your niche and just get out there and start doing it and figure out what gives you joy from the process. You're going to find something.
All right, I think that's all from us. So thank you so much, everybody. We are at the end of our time. This was truly a delight to participate in. For the students, if you could please take the survey that I dropped in the chat. It'll take you 3 minutes. It really helps me bring this kind of programming to more people across the country and spread the love for journalism and solutions. Thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you. Also, for the people that are going to be watching the recording, we will follow up at the bottom of the recording with the survey and everything